Today, I'd like to introduce Sue Lowry, who is our Water Talk seminar speaker. In 1981, she received a BS in Agricultural Economics from the University of Wyoming. Then from 81 to 85, she was an Ag Loan Officer. That was the good years, wasn't it?
Started the bad.
All those loans are now being, how many of those did you make?
More than I should have. Probably.
More than you should have, probably. Huh? And then she decided to come back to school in 1988. She received her MS degree in Range Management / Water Resources program from the University of Wyoming. Completed the master's thesis research at Muddy Creek Research Area, estimating the economic benefits derived from riparian zones and differing channel conditions, and that's what you're going to hear about today. And this is her speech for her MS thesis too. We didn't say that to her, but we're always trying to get these people come back when they don't do that. Right now, presently, she's the Interstate Streams Engineer for the State Engineer's Office. Works primarily with interstate compacts and decrees, and more recently with the Wind River Indian Reservation, analyzing the effects of the recent award of 500,000 acre-feet of water to the reservation on non-Indian water rights users in the area. And so if you want to know anything about that case, you can ask Sue now. She's trying to get up to speed on it.
Not making much progress.
But today she's going to talk about her thesis. Okay, and today her talk is entitled Economic Value of Riparian Zones and Differing Channel Conditions in Wyoming, or as Quentin would say, the Muddy Creek Project. So Sue.
Okay, well thanks, Vic. It's a pleasure to be back here, as I'm sure you could gather from the little write-up that I sent over for Vic. I spent a lot of years here. It seems like I was sort of a professional student for a while, and there are some things about being around campus that I do kind of miss. There are a few things about having a real job that are kind of nice as well, but it's fun to be back, and I was happy to be able to come over and present a water talk when Steve Gloss called and asked if could come and talk about Muddy Creek. A couple of years ago, it seemed like practically all of these talks had something to do with Muddy Creek, but I see quite a few new faces in the audience now that maybe haven't had the extreme pleasure of getting to see Muddy Creek. So I'll try to give some background as far as what we were trying to do out there. The economic evaluation was only a small part of looking at groundwater, the vegetation, a lot of other things, and a lot of other people did their master's work out there as well. So I'll try to give at least a brief overview as far as the whole project out there. I guess if I could go ahead and have the slides, please.
And Jeff, you can try and turn off the lights. There we go.
Okay, I think, and before I get started, just, hey there, how are you? I'd like to say that if you have any questions, feel free to jump in here whenever. I think there's enough light on that just feel free to speak out if something's not quite clear. I think most of us in the room would feel pretty comfortable that the value of this kind of riparian area versus one that's in this condition, that there probably is a difference in the types of values that are derived from those two areas. But just how large of a difference there is and what types of benefits do differ because the areas are in different channel condition has not really been quantified. And that was what we made an attempt to do, was to determine whether these riparian zones do have economic value, and if they do, can we somehow come up with a dollar value to place on those benefits. So that was our overall objective, was to determine the economic value of riparian zones that are in differing channel conditions in Wyoming. Our methodology was to do a fairly extensive literature review and see if anyone had attempted to do this already, if they had put dollar values on some of the benefits. Our next step was then to use the dollar values that we found from the literature review and then apply those to the actual measured changes, the actual physical parameters that are different in those differing channel conditions that we did derive at Muddy Creek. So first of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about the values that we found from the literature review. when I first started this project, it became fairly obvious that no one had really done any economic work in riparian zones themselves. We couldn't really glean from the literature a starting point. There were no dollar values out there. So we sort of stepped back a little bit and said, well, how can we come up with these dollar values? And our approach then was to find dollars that were attached to vegetation, that were attached to water quality parameters, that were attached to groundwater storage, and then apply those dollar values to what we were finding at Muddy Creek. There were 4 main benefit areas that we felt were derived from the riparian zones at Muddy Creek and other typical perennial streams of the Great Basin area. The first was vegetation. If a riparian zone is in good condition, you'll get an increase in vegetation production. The second was the storage of sediments. If you can keep those sediments in the upland areas, what's that worth to downstream municipalities that then don't have to filter those sediments out, or to downstream reservoirs that then if those sediments are not kept in the reservoir, it will lengthen the life of those storage facilities. The salts that are associated with those sediments, another water quality parameter, that was our third main benefit area. And then the fourth was groundwater storage. I'd like to go through each of those now and just give you a rough idea of the kind of dollar values that we came up with. And then later on, I'll give a summary of the physical parameters that were measured at Muddy Creek and how we applied these dollar values per unit to those changes that we actually measured at the Muddy Creek site. So the first main area is vegetation, which is a benefit to 2 separate categories, I guess, that have a market, livestock and wildlife. Livestock was probably the most straightforward benefit to place a dollar value on of any of the 4, because there is an established market in the private sector for animal unit months. The federal lease rate at the time that I did this work was $1.35 to give an estimate of what animal unit months are worth on the public lands. The Muddy Creek site there is quite a bit of BLM land out there, so we felt that was an appropriate number to use. And then the private lease rate of about $8 per AUM, which I think is still pretty average. For wildlife, we had a couple of different approaches. In our economic analysis, we looked at 2 different points of view. One was from the private landowner's point of view and the kinds of benefits that he would be able to derive, actual money that would come back to him. The second point of view is from society as a whole. What's it worth for a federal agency to be able to manage these areas, because they are managing land on behalf of all Americans, and there's additional benefits that can be counted when you're looking at it from society's point of view. So for the private landowner, because that's money coming back to him, we use trespass fees. Jim Jacobs and some other folks over in the Ag Economics Department had done a survey of trespass fees that are charged by Wyoming landowners. I believe that was for deer. The 1744 deer and antelope tend to be very close to one another, and that is for a hunt. They came up with a dollar value per day and then an average number of days that hunters spend. The 73 came from the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, had done some work on what willingness to pay values are, and those are more, again, from society's point of view. That's what a hunter is willing to pay in order to come to Wyoming for the experience of hunting. And again, I used antelope. I think deer was just a couple of dollars difference one way or the other. And deer and antelope are primarily what are at Muddy Creek. Okay, the second main category of water quality. For the sediments, I had found some research that was done by I believe the Bureau of Reclamation in conjunction with the filling of reservoirs. If they could keep sediment out of their storage sites and prolong the life, what would that be worth? Came up with some dollar values of around 27 cents up to 58 cents per ton of sediment. That's what their cost was if those sediments wound up in the reservoir. And the second water quality parameter that we looked at of salinity, there's been quite a bit of salinity work done in the Colorado River. Muddy Creek is a tributary to the Colorado eventually, so we felt it was appropriate to go ahead and use the research that had been done in conjunction with the Colorado River, and found a range of $30 up to about $82 per ton of salt. Okay, and our third main benefit area of water quantity, of what these various users of water are willing to pay for the water that they need for either for agriculture, for industrial uses, or by municipalities. You can see irrigation is quite a bit lower, $12.50 per acre foot. Industries get up to a fairly high value, up in the 140s per acre foot. You'll see quoted in the newspapers values up to like $2,000 to $3,000 per acre foot. Particularly around the Reno area out in Nevada, they're experiencing a lot of growth, and there's not a lot of water out there. The Phoenix area, LA, all of Southern California, in fact. Those dollar values are the purchase of a water right in perpetuity. They have then access to that water for as long as that particular source has flowing water or groundwater. What I tried to do in order to get all of these values on a comparable basis is then bring that $2,000 to $3,000 single payment back to an annual amount. I used a 30-year planning horizon and I believe an 8% opportunity cost. If you haven't had economics, you probably don't really care about all this stuff. But the idea was to get everything back to an annual cost. So if you see those $2,000 and $3,000 figures, and you think, well, gee, she said it was only worth $140. That's the reason that the large difference. Okay, so now that we know roughly what the per unit values may be for those benefits, how are we going to apply those to the actual physical changes that we're measuring in the different types of channel conditions? So I'd like to talk a little bit about the Muddy Creek site. We had two main objectives in using the Muddy Creek case study. The first objective was to determine what the difference is in economic terms of riparian zones that are in different types, in different conditions. What's a degraded stream worth versus what's a restoring or an improved stream worth. Our second main objective then was to look at the reclamation aspect. Can you afford to go in and enhance or accelerate the natural repairing process of these stream systems that have been downcut because of building roads or overgrazing, or a number of reasons could cause the downcutting. Muddy Creek site is located about midway between Interstate 80 and Baggs in south central Wyoming, so roughly 60, 70 miles southwest of Rawlins. That's a typical perennial stream of the Great Basin area. The uplands are dominated by greasewood and sagebrush, very few grasses and forbs relative to the shrub production. The site itself was divided into several segments based on the channel condition of the area. There's only two of these areas that I used for my thesis, and that's the restored area, and it's the most downstream area. That's where the in-stream structures are installed, and the degraded reach, which is the most upstream, and it's below where the active head cutting is taking place. About midway in between these two is an area that's in excellent condition due to past management, time of grazing. There's been no alteration to the channel that would cause downcutting. And I believe some additional work is now going on in that improved section. And there's a short description of each of the ones. On some of the slides where I show the results, this RSR and DSR abbreviation is used. I will also at times slip and refer to them as Reach 2 and Reach 6. At that time we had up to 6 sites, but the degraded is the one that's in poor condition. The restoring one is where the trash collectors were installed. There's a shot of the Degraded Reach. You can see pretty steep slopes, very little inner floodplain development, very little vegetation down in the banks. You can see on this meander up at the top here, very little willow or any other kind of growth out on the mud flat there. There's another shot later in the year. In comparison to Reach 6, the restoring reach, a lot of willow moving in. It doesn't take much of an increase in flow to get over bank flooding to where you get then storage back in the other areas of the floodplain. And this is the area where the trash collectors were installed. So I'd take a second just to describe how they work. Trenches are dug perpendicular to the stream, back in about 10 feet roughly on each side. Steel posts are then driven in the back of the trenches. And here's the materials that you need to make one of these devices. Underneath this black erosion mat material is woven wire, just regular hog-sized woven wire. The flap in the middle actually goes into the stream to prevent erosion of the channel itself. The flaps on each side then are put back into the trenches that are dug into the bank. The woven wire is tied on to the fence posts. You can see the spare tires in the background there. They're all tied together also with heavy baling wire. They're placed on top of the erosion mat material actually in the channel, and that pile of sagebrush there is stuck inside the spare tires to further slow velocity and get sediments to deposit. So the goal was to use inexpensive materials, things that would be around a BLM yard or a rancher's headquarters, things that could be put into the stream that wouldn't cause additional ecological problems and that were cheap. You didn't need to hire an engineer to come out and figure out how much concrete you'd need to pour. And here's installing them actually into the stream. And here's after they've been in place for a year. So you can see they do catch a lot of sediment behind them. They are put in series depending on the length of the straight section versus the meander section. I believe the first year there were 32 installed. After that there were 16 within the restored reach, and now they're down to putting in about 8 per year. And they're put right on top of where last year's sediment occurred, and then these are eventually completely covered, raising the channel. The goal is to get additional overbank flooding during the high flow periods in the spring. And you can see these were probably taken in August, it's not flowing too much by this time. Okay, so now let's go back to our main benefits that we talked about before and discuss a little bit how we determined the relative difference or relative amounts of those benefits that are derived from the two different channel conditions. First of all, livestock. There was extensive vegetation sampling done at this site. Estimations were done in addition to clipping, bringing back and getting dried weights separated by species, which turned out to be very important for being able to estimate the usable species. Deer obviously use a bit different type vegetation than what either sheep or cattle will use if given their preference anyway. From the vegetation information that was taken, I was able to estimate the overall vegetation production on each of the reaches, convert that then to animal unit months. For livestock, I took the usable species, figured they'd use some of the willow, the forbs, the grasses. The thistle production out here is something that you really have to see to believe. It gets 6 feet tall easily. I guessed that cattle probably wouldn't eat that if they were given their preference. So I separated all that out. Used a 65% utilization rate. Of that utilized forage, then assumed in English terms that's about 800 pounds per AUM. I think that's a pretty average amount that the public land management agencies use, and found the total number of animal unit months, multiplied that by the range of dollars that I had found through the literature review. Wildlife did a fairly similar process, only used the shrub species. The Muddy Creek area is used primarily as winter range by deer in the area. Used a 40% utilization rate, this 0.8 kilograms per animal per day of intake. I got from some work that was done by another range student out in the Red Desert. He was looking at antelope out there, and I made the giant assumption that deer would be the same. This 35% I got from Game and Fish. That's a rough estimate of the number of licenses that are issued based on the population out there. So I figured the increase in the number of animals that could be sustained because of the increased vegetation production, and then how many licenses would be sold, since that was what I was valuing. My dollar amount was on hunters. For the federal agency, I then took that number of licenses and multiplied it by the willingness to pay. That's $73 that people are willing to pay to come to Wyoming and hunt antelope. And then for the private landowner, I took that same number of licenses and multiplied it by the, what was it, $17, whatever the average trespass fee was for an average hunt in Wyoming. I might just mention here that there are many additional benefits that are derived by having antelope and deer running around on the plains of Wyoming. I think it's probably the reason that a lot of us live here. But because we don't pay anything to anybody for the privilege of seeing deer and antelope when we drive down the highway, there's really no one getting that money back. And there's been very few studies on these additional aesthetic values. If there was some additional information around, you could go ahead and add those in. The person who doesn't hunt but that enjoys wildlife, what their willingness to pay is for the privilege of seeing those animals could be added in here, but that work has just not been done by any of the economics departments that I'm aware of anyway. So I'll take a quick look now at the actual results out there. On the degraded stream reach, we're getting about 50 animal unit months, and on the recovering reach, about 38. So a pretty good-sized increase in the benefits that are derived from those two channel conditions. Multiplying it by the dollar, the range of dollar values, top end about $40 here, up to $300 there. In order to do an economic analysis of whether it's worth it to put in the in-stream structures or not, I had to estimate what would have been derived from the recovering reach if the dams had not been put in place. You can't compare the degraded stream reach and assume that it will look like the recovering stream reach. They're too far apart. There's just a lot of reasons why you can't use those two as your comparison. What's better from an economic standpoint is to do a with and without analysis. And so I was able to estimate what would have been derived, used a 30-year planning horizon. So over that 30 years, what would have been derived from the restoring stream reach versus what is being derived because after the dams were in place. You can see there's not a whole lot of difference here. This is over the 30-year planning horizon, and $1,000 over 30 years is really not all that much money. The reason for that is because the restoring stream reach was in much better condition prior to installing the dams. So there's not, because the dams are in place, you didn't see all that large of an increase in production. For wildlife, did a similar process again. The value of the increased production, about $53 on the degraded stream reach, about $380 on the recovering. So again, a fairly large dollar difference. Again, the present value. This is only reach 6 again, only the recovering stream reach. And again, what, $1,100 difference, something like that over the 30-year planning horizon. Move on to the water quality parameters and trying to estimate what those benefits are. Our methodology for determining physically what the changes are in the sediment deposition, how much is deposited in each of those stream reaches, Each of the stream reaches were surveyed. Survey cross-sections, permanent cross-sections were in place. The degraded, or the recovering stream reach had also been surveyed prior to the dams being in place. So again, we could do our with and without analysis. From some aerial photos that were done, I was able to determine the area of deposition of the sediments. So from the surveyed work, I knew the depth, and from the air photo work, I knew the area. From some soils work that had been done out there, I had an estimate of what the bulk density was, and then I could determine what the tons of sediment deposited were on both of the stream reaches. There were control areas on the restoring stream reach that were out of influence of the dams, and so was able to use that information then for the with and without analysis to determine whether it was cost effective to install the dams. So some results, the amounts deposited, you can see the number of tons deposited annually are quite a bit different. About 1,600 tons on the degraded stream reach, up to about 8,600 on the restoring stream reach. There's quite a bit of erosion going on in this section, and not all that much deposition, and almost all deposition taking place on the restoring stream reach. There weren't that many areas where further erosion was taking place. The value then of keeping those sediments in the upland areas up to about 940 on the degraded stream reach, and up to about 5,000. So again, a pretty good difference in the two channel conditions. The with and without analysis, I'm starting to see about $10,000 difference. So a much bigger variation, I guess, between having the dams in place and without them in place than we saw with the vegetation, which I guess is to be expected. And those pictures showed a lot of deposition taking place. The depths were getting to be 3 and 4 feet in some places. So, and it doesn't take a very large volume to weigh a ton of sediment. Okay, the salts associated with those sediments. There is a typo on these slides. Those commas should be periods. It's 1.847, and over there's 3.6. We didn't have 3,600 tons of salt deposit. Just a little bit on our methodology. Soils work had been done out there from the information from the soils lab. We're able to determine the salts associated with the sediments. Since I knew the total volume of sediment deposit, I was just able to multiply it by that ratio and come up with an estimation of what the salts that were deposited are. The annual values much, much lower than what we saw with the sediments. About 150 on the high end on the degraded reach, up to about 300 on the restoring reach. With the dams in place, again, not a real large increase over that 30-year planning horizon. On the high end, a difference of about $500 up to $1,100. Okay, our third main benefit area of groundwater storage. We were able to determine a rough estimate, very rough, I might add, of what the total acre feet of storage was in the shallow aquifers on each of the stream reaches. Had a series of groundwater wells across the floodplain. Additional groundwater work has been done since I've been gone from here. Scott Bowman is doing his master's at this site and has done quite a bit of additional work. So this is probably out of date now, but I wanted to put this in just to show the depths and the distribution of the wells across the floodplain. And from those monitoring wells, then we're able to come up with an estimation of the acre feet that were stored within the riparian area. Since we knew the acre feet that was stored, we could then multiply it by what that water is worth to these variety of water users. And this slide is pretty busy. If we just look at this column first, during the 86 to 87 year, in the degraded stream reach, had about 180 acre feet stored and about 500 stored in the restoring stream reach. The two areas are not of equal area either, so we need to keep that in mind, that we're not talking two exact same size stream reaches. So we need to to put this on a per hectare or per mile of stream basis to be able to compare the two. Again, irrigation values are pretty low relative to the other two users, up to around $6,000 here. Where you can see $70,000 at the $140 per acre foot value if that water were used by municipalities or by industry. I may just take a moment to throw out that we understand that water at Muddy Creek today is not worth $70,000. The reason we went through this whole analysis was to say, if you had a stream of this size, let's say upstream on the Truckee River, where it would be feasible to pipe this water to, say, Reno or Sparks, it very well might be worth that much money. 30 years from now, who knows how much the Front Range is going to grow. It may be feasible to take Colorado River water to the Front Range side. And they've done a lot of that in Colorado already. And so I think it's worthwhile to go through the analysis and just say, if this site were somewhere near an area that was in need of additional water, what kind of dollar values might we be looking at? Up to now, we've talked pretty much just about the benefits associated with these areas. In order to install the dams, there were some costs associated with the construction and installation of the dams. A single dam cost, and again, this is with new materials. Many either BLM offices or ranchers are going to have a lot of these materials just lying around. But from an economic standpoint, needed to look at what the total cost was. So takes about 4 hours labor by 4 people to get one installed. Used graduate student labor rate there. About 6 steel posts on the average to secure them in the channel, about 30 feet of the woven wire, and about 10 yards of the erosion mat material. So around 110 for each dam. That's a little dark, but the plan was to install these collectors from 1984 till 1991. As I mentioned earlier, there were about 32 in the first year, 16 for the next 2 years, and then 8 each year after that. I then used a 4% and 8% discount rate, so roughly $10,000 was the total cost over that 30-year planning period to get the structures installed for the entire restoring reach. So now our third objective was to examine the economic feasibility of installing these structures. So some of those present value amounts were listed on the previous slides, but I wanted to throw up a couple more summary slides concerning only the with and without analysis. And again, the 3 points of view. And I split the federal agency one without the groundwater sales and looked at that, and then also with it, recognizing that this wasn't going to occur for several years, at least at the Muddy Creek side, it wasn't going to. So from the private landowner's point of view, here's what he can expect as an annual value from the 2 reaches. Total of 93 versus 686. So a fairly large increase in having the channel in a restored condition. And then I did separate these out on a per hectare and per kilometer basis in order to compare the 2 reaches a little more accurately. And here's the present value over the 30-year planning horizon again. I think that the main thing that this slide emphasizes is that because the rancher only gets actual dollars back in his hand from the vegetation, he doesn't get anything because the sediments are deposited. He doesn't really get anything because there's salts there. Nobody's coming and paying him to store those sediments. It doesn't appear to be cost effective for him to put in the structures. He's getting roughly $9,000 off. This is all Reach 6 again that we're looking at. He gets about $9,000 over that 30-year planning period. at a 4% discount rate. And if he were to put the dams in, because of the cost of the dams, he's only getting about $1,000 back. But it is still in the black. So if he recognizes that there are additional ecological benefits associated with having riparian zones in good condition, even though he's not actually getting dollars back in his pocket now, he may someday, he can still afford to do it. He gets money, he gets a positive net return for installing those structures. If he thinks his money's worth 8%, though, he doesn't, just because of the delay in receiving those benefits that are down in year 25 and 26 and 27. If you have a feeling that your money is worth more, those values are going to be worth less to you today. That's the basis of figuring net present values. But now from the federal agency's point of view, who, because they are managing for society, they are looking out for you and me. I know that probably makes you feel a lot better. They can include those things like sediment deposition, less salts getting to the Imperial Valley in California. Those kinds of benefits can then be included in the economic analysis. The two things to compare here are the white block, which is what Unit 6, the Restoring Stream Reach, would return to society if the dams were not in place. So that's roughly, say 22,000. And the red, which is the net benefit after you have the dams in place. And that's probably, say, 32,000, something like that. So from society's point of view, it is worthwhile to have the dams in place. It is, the net value of those dams being there is higher than what would have been derived from the Restoring Stream Reach had the reclamation process not been accelerated by installing the dams. I threw this slide in to show, again, I'm from the federal agency's point of view without the groundwater sales. So this is only the livestock, wildlife, and the water quality parameters water quality benefits that we're looking at here. And I wanted to show, I guess, how much the sediment deposition amounted for relative to the other three. That when you start including the values of holding those sediments in the uplands, that's really the large one. Probably 2/3, 3/4 of the whole value associated with having the collectors in place is because of the sediments. And here's a look at, with the groundwater sales considered, a lot higher, even than the sediments relative to these two was quite a bit more. And now if you could someday show that there were water users who are willing to come in and purchase that water, that would be much greater even than the values associated with holding those sediments in the uplands. So I wanted to conclude with saying that hopefully by doing some of this work, we're no longer groping for values associated with what the riparian zones are worth. And I would hope anyway that the results of this research show that riparian zones do have economic value associated with them. Riparian zones that are in differing conditions also have different economic conditions, that those in a restored or an improved state are more valuable. And thirdly, that from society's point of view, it's certainly worthwhile to install the collectors, and that from the private landowner's point of view, he can still afford to pay for it. He's still in the black if he puts those in, but his total benefits received will not be as high as if he had just left the area to restore in a natural series, I guess, or to let nature take its course. So that's all I have. I'd be glad to answer any questions. If anybody has any? Yeah, Mike?
Did you think about trying to incorporate the fact that left untouched, some areas may not remain static, but in fact degrade, and that prevention not cure, putting in some structures where you have reasonably good conditions now might not only
Right.
improve, but avoid degradation.
Right, and if we had some data to show, or at least be able to estimate what that future degradation might be, you could easily justify putting in those structures, I think. It's just that at this particular site, we didn't really have any numbers to go on. I think and I don't know, maybe Vic or Bob, maybe you know, that were they planning on putting an additional structure at the bottom of Reach 2 to do sort of that very thing?
They've been talking about it. They're
Nothing's
still working
happened,
on it,
though,
but
but-
nothing's happened.
yeah.
They've got all the agencies involved, and whether that will actually happen
Okay.
or not has not been decided.
They say that kind of thing is what they're looking at, is actually going and putting a much larger structure, something actually concrete, that go in and, I don't know how high it would be, but at the bottom of Reach 2, the degraded reach, go in and try and get that section, the channel bottom, to try to increase, because the head cutting is still taking place going upstream, and if you could stop that, that would be
Yeah, that's what
worth a lot.
That's sort of thing that I was thinking about.
Yeah.
So where is the head cut now in relation to your section numbers?
Section 1 is obviously above Section 2, and I suppose it's, 2 miles of stream, maybe? Something like that. But 1 year, it moved, I don't know, half a mile
so the
within like 2
current head
days.
cut is in-
So, is in Reach 1, which wasn't shown on there. The
Yeah.
highway is going like this, and it comes back across the bottom bridge is the bottom of Reach 2. Top of Reach 2 is right by a farm, a house, a ranch
okay, so
headquarters.
it's
And then
just
Reach 1
upstream.
is another,
Yeah.
mile and a half upstream of that. So it's from the head cut to the beginning of Reach 2 would be the mile and a half.
And the head cut's like 15 feet high.
Yeah.
It's big.
It's pretty awesome when it goes
Oh,
down.
that's why I was thinking that seems to me that would be a really important consideration.
They are going to do that.
But
That has been
But just in, yeah.
That has been decided. They're going to put something at the upstream, at the bottom.
Because the reason that we didn't examine that, the sort of, the economists have a name for that. It's like costs avoided, or something to that effect anyway. So we just didn't know what would happen. We didn't have the physical changes, the information to then put these unit values to. But in an area, or as we gather more of this kind of information, I think you could then make the estimation of what would happen if you saw a big head cut move through there. We got to get the highway on board. I mean, they're the evil, the primary guys that go in there, take out a couple of meanders, put in a nice big bridge, and then watch the head cut go upstream. If you could go to an area where you thought maybe that was going to happen, or felt fairly confident it would happen, and then put in some of these structures, and if it didn't occur, then you'd feel pretty secure that maybe you'd helped out that particular area. They've done it, some work up in the Bighorn Basin too with these, put some in by Kirby, and I'm really not familiar enough with that area, but they have tried to do this in some different types of areas too. Yeah, Wayne?
404 permits required for this kind of stuff.
Or state water permits. I was hoping somebody would ask me that. I don't think they got them. And you don't need, let me see if I get this right. You may be able to help me here, okay? If you go in and put in a new diversion dam, say for a small irrigation head gate or whatever, there are nationwide permits that cover those. You're supposed to let the Corps know, but they don't come out and make you draw up plans or do any of that. But I mean, you're not really filling, other than with a few shovelfuls of, and you're not dredging with anything other than a Pulaski. So I don't know.
You want me to answer that?
Yeah.
a little bit? The answer is that
We got together with the Corps of Engineers, people in Cheyenne here, not 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, I can't remember what it was. And all of our gauging stations throughout the state that we put in for research projects and other things, we showed them all where they were, submitted the stuff so that we got covered under a all-encompassing permit.
at the same time, we filed on some of these and got them covered under that particular item. As far as the state engineer ruling on the water storage aspects, he was nice enough, he's just been ignoring it for the present time. And that was from Christopolis through the present state engineer. In the future, I think that they will probably have to do that. They were concerned, it just turned out that Muddy Creek was not a hot issue.
I was wondering if permitting would be done by the landowners.
If a downstream water right holder came to us and said, I am being injured because Joe Blow is putting in those structures, the state engineer would have the authority to say, those things aren't permitted, they're not dams, go breach them, you know, in essence. But they could also help downstream people because then you're getting return flows later into the summer. So if you didn't build them high enough, and if you were in an area like Muddy Creek where you get just that huge surge in the springtime, and downstream people are going to have all the water they need anyway, it would only be probably in cases like the Platte or the fully appropriated areas, the Bear, where there's just not enough water to go around even during that big flush during the springtime. So I think on these upper basin, I know everything that drains to the Green River, there's just way more water than what anybody uses, and I don't think, at least from state engineers' viewpoint, they're just going to look the other way pretty much. So.
From the water quality standpoint, we've also been questioned by the DEQ.
Yeah, water quality permits.
Yes,
Yeah.
that we don't have permits for storing sediment and things, and that's been a sore point for some time also.
I just remind everybody to use the red buttons on the mics when they're asking questions, otherwise it doesn't come out on video too well.
Anything else? Yeah?
Who made those nifty slides?
That's right. QD Skinner. Aren't they nice? The nice maroon ones and the green together? Yeah.
Did you consider changing the number of structures you put in and what effect? I mean, that perhaps not putting in 32, rather than putting in 24 could have changed your economics enough to really help you or hurt you?
That determination was made pretty much before I came on board, and the overriding factor pretty much is the ratio or the distance of your straight sections versus where the meanders are. And to tell you the truth, I don't really know how they came up with the 32 to begin with.
Well, being one of the people that put in the 32, we put one in every place we could find a spot. So there wasn't a whole lot of plan except that we had so much reach to work with, and we just looked at meanders and straights, and every time there was a straight after a meander that could fit 2 or 3 in and it was within our study area boundary, we put them in. And that's all the decision there was. It was just at that point a demonstration project, and simply we were trying to see, you know, how much storage, low-term storage we could have. There wasn't a whole lot of major objectives or thought about economics at that time.
I think since it was for demonstration purposes, they wanted to make sure it worked. You know? So now, since we know a little bit more, it is at least conceivable anyway that if you went into a new area, you wouldn't have to put in as many, and you could hold your costs down a little bit. Yeah, Dennis?
Sue, I need a little clarification on how the wildlife values were calculated.
Okay.
Essentially, how did that happen? With the improved riparian habitat, are there increased numbers of antelope that therefore attract increased numbers of hunters then, or people who would like to be in that area? Is it because of the antelope, or is it because of non-game species that the land then becomes more valuable for wildlife?
I guess the assumption was made that since it is primarily winter habitat and winter range is the limiting factor over there, that because of an improvement in the vegetation that was available, populations would increase simply because winter range improved, and that since that is what's limiting currently, and they, I talked to Game and Fish for quite a while about, well, if you have more vegetation, and still if they're already at their herd, what do they have a name for it? It's the levels that they would like to achieve. They have limits on all of their population, all of their herds around the state. They have population limits of what the level they would like to be at. And that was one that they felt there was enough hunter interest that they could increase the numbers. But.
Okay, but are the antelope really benefiting from more forage on the winter range or just more water availability? I just wonder, or is it, and were the calculations made on the basis of the antelope's response to the riparian habitat?
That was our assumption, that population numbers would increase because winter range habitat improved. That may be a false assumption, I don't know. That was how we approached it, was that because there was an improvement in winter range, that population levels would increase. Yeah, Dick?
Yeah, Sue, on the sediment part, the studies I've looked at that try to assign dollar values to sediment generally take two different approaches. And one would be to come up with a dollar value based on the cost of treating the water, removing the sediment, whereas other studies look at the value of benefits received from having sediment-free water. Did you try to separate out those two kinds of studies, or?
Really didn't. The information that I found, oh gosh, this has been, 4 years ago now, really a couple of Bureau Reclamation studies were all I was able to locate, and I believe that their point of view was more they looked at it more from the reservoir storage concept, but yet some water economists will say it's okay for that dam to fill up after 40 years because then the life of the dam, and we had a 40-year planning period, and at the end of that we considered that reservoir to not be worth anything anyway. So if you're one of the believers of that school of thought, then you'd say what I just did here, there's no value anyway. But if you're a municipality and looking at the value gained because you don't have to take those sediments out, then are you familiar enough with the numbers to know if that's even close? Is that 27 cents per ton? Even in the ballpark?
A wide range of values depending what kind of environment the sediment's being removed from. That was the other part of my question I wanted to follow up with. Is did you only look at semi-arid streams, or did you look at humid regions, mountain streams, just combine all sediment removal studies? Or?
Yeah, the only ones I looked at were the ones in the Colorado River Basin, and they were mostly associated with Lake Powell. So, and then some municipal stuff on downstream, more the salinity-related things, the Yuma desalinization plant, and that thing costs several $1 million. So if you can show that, now this is more the salts rather than the sediments, but if you can show you're holding those salts in the uplands, I mean, it could be worth, but you've got to hold the sediments before you can hold the salts, so I guess it's all pretty much related. But. Yeah.
On your cost benefit at the end, you were saying that it was 9,000 without the dam and 1,000 if they put the dam in. Is that per dam, or is that per unit of density of dams?
That's the total 30-year planning horizon for the entire Reach 6.
That was what, 6 kilometers or the 7 kilometers?
Yeah, it's a little more than that, I think. I don't know, I should remember that, sorry. But yeah, per kilometer, I'm not sure what that, I have that information. If you'd like to get that, I could sure get it to you, but I don't have it remember off the top of my head.
But as the density of dams would increase, wouldn't the sediment load decrease, and then also your deposition of salts and so forth?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the difference is. I don't remember from the cross-section whether there's a significant difference in the amounts of sediments that are deposited upstream versus the lowest set. You would expect, anyway, that the waters with the most sediment in them are going to hit the dams, and the sediment load is going to drop out, and you're going to have cleaner and cleaner water as you get downstream and have less. But to a certain degree that was true, but I don't think it was as much as what you might have expected. And I don't know that we've really done enough work to be able to know how far those straight sections need to be apart from one another. And a sort of an associated problem is once you have clean water at the bottom, is it just going to be hungry water again and then start to erode everything that's just downstream from your check dams? So I don't know, you'd have to look at what the cost or the net benefits turned out to be per kilometer of stream, I guess, and then try to make an estimation of what that difference is in the sediments that you're holding farthest downstream versus the stuff farthest upstream. But I'm not sure. Yes, Steve.
Sue, you may have covered this in the first part that I missed, but can you account for how much of the sediment dynamics in the system arises from channel erosion and modification versus how much is coming from the uplands?
Well, I don't know that, I didn't look at that, and I don't know whether Tom and some of his work looked at that or not, but I guess just off the top of my head, I'd say that a large percent of it is going to be channel modification just because of that big head cut that's moving up still, and the overland increase or overland proportion is going to be fairly small. I'd just guess, maybe 80-20 or something like that. If you could ever get the head cut stopped, then that proportion would probably change, but right at the moment it's still, and off of Reach 2 in the springtime, you're just having huge slabs fall off of those, the meander, inside meanders, and so I would guess that a pretty large chunk of it is all stream channel modification. Yeah, Mark?
Okay, just to complicate your life a little bit. So, you say that your sediment values come up are just between the restoring and the degraded. I have always had this question, don't you think maybe your sediment, the amount of sediment you're retaining is a conservative figure given that we have that improved or actually excellent condition riparian zone in between the two reaches? Because something I found with my project is that excellent condition riparian zone is dropping the sediments and dropping the salts. So I'm seeing a lower base level to begin with down in Unit 6. And I'm just wondering if, because of that, we should kind of consider your value for putting the dams in to be slightly conservative.
Yeah, I'm not sure that. Do you think during spring flow, though, when things are really happening down through there, is much dropping out in George Dew, or is it all? You need the lower flows before any of that happens? I don't know. I have to. Yeah. I don't know. We done?
Yeah. I think we'll cut it off, and if you want to stay and talk.